Hello, my dear viewers. Before anything else, tell me how your heart is today. Calm, tired, hopeful? Whatever it is, hold on to it, because tonight I have a story for you about a woman who was told she would never be enough, and the quiet way she proved the whole world wrong. If you love stories where patience becomes power and heartbreak becomes triumph, stay with me, and do not forget to subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Clara Whitmore stood at the edge of the Winmore ballroom in a gown the color of deep pine forests, her gloved hands folded in front of her, like a woman holding herself together by habit alone. Candlelight moved across the emerald velvet and caught the small diamonds pinned into her upswept hair. She did not smile. She did not need to. Every person in that room already knew her name, though most of them had spent the last year pretending they did not. A year earlier, in a much smaller room with much dimmer light, Edmund Carlyle had looked at her the way a man looks at an old coat he has outgrown. He had told her, in front of her own family, that she was not the kind of woman a rising man could be seen with. He had said it kindly, which made it worse. Kindness wrapped around cruelty is still cruelty, only quieter. Tonight, Edmund walked toward her again, dressed in a navy coat too tailored for his own good, a smirk already forming before he even reached her. He did not know yet what she had built in the space where he had broken her. He did not know that behind her, through the tall oak doors of the Winmore ballroom, stood the reason his entire fortune was about to disappear. "Still single, Clara?" he said, loud enough for the small crowd near him to hear, loud enough for his new fiancée, Lady Priscilla Fenwick, to giggle behind her fan. Clara did not answer right away. She simply looked past his shoulder, toward the doors that had just begun to open. 1 year before the gala, Clara Whitmore had believed her life was settled. She was 24, the eldest daughter of a bookkeeper who had died leaving more debts than answers, and she had spent 3 years engaged to Edmund Carlyle, a merchant's son with ambitions bigger than his birth. She had loved him the plain way. People love someone they have known since childhood, without drama, without questions, the way you love a familiar road. The engagement dinner was held at the Carlyle townhouse, all white linen and borrowed silver, because Edmund's family wanted to look wealthier than they were. Clara wore her mother's old necklace, the only fine thing left in the house, and she sat at the table practicing the small, patient smile she had worn for years whenever Edmund's relatives asked when the wedding would finally happen. It never got the chance to happen. Halfway through the second course, Edmund's mother leaned toward her son and said, not quietly enough, "The Fenwick girl brings 12,000 a year, Edmund. 12,000. Edmund's fork paused over his plate. Clara watched his face change the way weather changes slowly at first. Then, all at once, by the end of the evening, he had asked to speak with her alone in the hallway. He held both her hands, which she would later think was the cruelest part, because it meant he touched her gently while ending everything. "You deserve someone who can give you a smaller, quieter life," he said. "I don't think that's me anymore." "Say what you mean, Edmund. Priscilla's family has connections mine will never have. I would be a fool to walk away from that." Clara did not cry in front of him. She waited until she was in the carriage, alone, the street lamps sliding past the window like slow tears themselves, before she let her shoulders finally drop. Her younger brother Thomas met her at the door of their narrow London house, worry already carved into his young face. "What happened?" "He found someone with a better income," Clara said, and laughed once, sharp and short, the kind of laugh that hides a wound instead of healing it. For weeks afterward, the whispers followed her everywhere, to church, to the market, to the modest sewing circle she attended on Thursdays. "Poor Clara Whitmore," they said, "left behind for a girl with better connections." She began to notice how people's eyes would flick to her ring finger, and then away, quickly, as though her bare hand embarrassed them. She could have stayed home and let the shame settle into her bones. In the weeks that followed, she tried. She sat in the front parlor with her needlework, accepted the sympathetic visits of neighbors who came only to look closely at her face and see how badly she had taken it, and answered the same questions over and over until the words lost their meaning. "Are you quite well, Clara? Will you recover, do you think?" As though a broken engagement were an illness she might survive if she rested enough. It was Thomas who finally said what needed to be said. He was 16, too young by most measures to be giving his older sister advice, but grief in their small household had made him grow up faster than boys usually did. "You keep apologizing to people for something Edmund did," he told her one evening, watching her fold linens with more force than the task required. "You didn't do anything wrong, Clara. You loved someone honestly. That was never the mistake." Then what was? Believing loving someone honestly was enough to keep him. She sat with that sentence for 3 days. On the 4th day, she stopped attending the sympathetic visits. On the 5th, their father's old friend Mr. Aldous, who ran a small printing house, mentioned over tea that Clara had always kept the family's books better than any clerk he'd hired since. It was a small compliment, said carelessly, but it lodged itself somewhere Clara had forgotten to protect. "You have a mind for numbers, girl," Mr. Aldous said. "It's a shame the world only ever asks women to have a mind for husbands." That night, unable to sleep, Clara took out her father's old accounting books, the ones she had kept simply because they were his, and worked through the columns by candlelight, the way she had as a girl, sitting on his knee, while he explained how numbers, unlike people, always told the truth if you looked closely enough. Numbers did not care whether her ring finger was bare. Numbers did not gossip. On a grey Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the engagement dinner, she found an advertisement folded into the London Gazette that Mr. Aldous had left behind. A private estate sought a literate woman with a strong grasp of accounts and correspondence. Discretion required. Live-in position considered. The estate was called Winmore. She did not yet know it belonged to one of the most powerful men in England. She wrote her letter of application that same night, before doubt could talk her out of it, and sealed it before she could read it over a 3rd time and lose her nerve. She only knew she needed a reason to leave the house where everyone pitied her, and a wage that did not depend on anyone's good opinion of her broken engagement. The reply came faster than she expected, a single line requesting she present herself at Winmore Hall the following week, signed not by a housekeeper or a steward, but by the Duke himself. Winmore Hall sat 2 hours outside London, a grey stone estate with more windows than Clara could count from the carriage that carried her up its long drive. She had expected a housekeeper to greet her. Instead, she was shown into a study, lined with ledgers, where a tall man, in a plain dark coat, stood with his back to her, studying a column of numbers as though they had personally offended him. "You're the one who answered the advertisement," he said, without turning. "Clara Whitmore, Your Grace." That made him turn. He had not expected her to already know his title, and for a moment something like respect flickered across his face. Duke Nathaniel Ashworth was younger than she had imagined a duke to be. Perhaps 32, with the tired eyes of a man who had spent too many nights doing work that was not his to do. "You know who I am, then. Everyone in London knows who you are, Your Grace. Very few of them know what you actually do all day." He almost smiled at that. "And what do you imagine I do all day, Miss Whitmore? Sign papers other men write for you, I would guess. Most men of your position do. I don't." He gestured at the ledgers stacked around the room, like a small, disorganized fortress. "Which is precisely my problem. Someone has been moving money out of my tenant relief accounts for over a year. Small amounts, disguised as repairs and grain purchases that never happened. My steward cannot find the pattern. My solicitor charges me by the hour to tell me he cannot find it either." Clara stepped closer to the desk, without being invited, which surprised them both. She lifted one of the ledgers, scanned 3 pages, and set it down again. "Your steward is looking at the amounts," she said. "He should be looking at the dates. Whoever is doing this waits until the day after your quarterly review. Every time. That is not carelessness. That is someone who knows your schedule better than you do." Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair for her at the desk an act so unexpected from a duke that Clara nearly refused it out of confusion. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Tell me everything you see." They worked until the candles burned low, and somewhere in the space between the third ledger and the fifth, Clara stopped thinking of him as a title and started thinking of him as a man who listened when she spoke, which was a rarer thing than she had realized. He asked her opinion twice. He wrote down her answers both times. When she finally rose to find her room for the night, he studied her, the way he had studied his ledgers earlier carefully, like something worth understanding. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "why does a woman with your mind not already have a position at twice the salary I am offering you?" Clara considered lying. She chose not to. "Because most men do not ask a woman what she sees, Your Grace. They ask her to sit quietly and look pleasant." "I find quiet women exhausting," Nathaniel said. "I would rather be told I am wrong than be agreed with by someone who has stopped thinking." It was the first thing anyone had said to her in a year that made her feel like more than the girl Edmund Carlyle had left behind. Her room at Winmore was small, but hers alone, tucked at the end of a corridor near the servants' stairs, and on her first morning, the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenn, brought her tea with a look of open curiosity. "His Grace kept you up past midnight in that study," Mrs. Fenn said, setting the tray down. "He's never done that with anyone before. Not the steward, not the solicitor, certainly not a governess candidate who answered a newspaper notice. Is that unusual?" "Miss Whitmore, the Duke of Ashworth has not trusted a soul with those accounts since his father died 5 years ago. He does the numbers himself at midnight because he does not believe anyone else will do them honestly." Mrs. Fenn studied her with new interest. "You must have said something worth hearing." Clara said nothing worth repeating, only that she had looked at the dates instead of the amounts, but she felt, for the first time in a long while, the quiet pride of being noticed for something true about herself, rather than something borrowed from a family name or a dowry. Over the following days, she settled into a rhythm unlike anything she had known in London mornings spent reviewing correspondence and tenant petitions, afternoons walking the grounds to clear her head, evenings in the study working through the tangled ledgers with Nathaniel, who she learned preferred bluntness to flattery and trusted people faster once they had disagreed with him at least once. "You disagreed with my assessment of the grain shortage in the North Fields yesterday," he said one evening, not looking up from his papers. "You were right, as it happens." "I know," Clara said. "I checked twice before I said anything. Most people would have simply agreed with me and let the fields fail. Most people are afraid of losing a position they need. I decided early that I would rather lose a position than lie about numbers I understand better than the person paying me." Nathaniel looked up at that, something unreadable in his expression, and said only, "Good. Keep deciding that." 3 months passed, and Clara became something closer to a partner than a clerk, though her wages still arrived as though she were only staff. Together, she and Nathaniel traced the missing funds to a name that made him go very still: Bartholomew Reyes, his own cousin and estate agent, a man who had managed the Winmore tenant accounts for 6 years and had used that trust the way a thief uses a key he was never meant to keep. But the fraud ran deeper than one dishonest cousin. Buried in the falsified grain receipts, Clara found a second name that appeared again and again as a supplier who was never actually paid by a shipping company quietly owned, she discovered after weeks of careful tracing through public records and old newspapers, by the family of Edmund Carlyle. The first time she saw the name Carlyle Shipping Concerns written into a false grain receipt, she nearly dropped the ledger. She checked the entry 3 times, certain her eyes had simply arranged familiar letters into a shape that frightened her. But the name did not change, no matter how many times she read it, and beneath it, in smaller print, a signature she recognized from old family correspondence, Edmund's father, Mr. Josiah Carlyle. She spent that night walking the length of her small room, instead of sleeping, turning the discovery over the way she once turned over Edmund's final words to her, searching for an angle that made it easier to hold. It did not get easier. The family who had called her too poor to marry had grown richer, in part, by stealing food and repairs from tenant families who had nothing at all. She did not tell Nathaniel right away. She sat with the discovery alone for 2 days, turning it over like a stone in her palm, before she finally brought the papers to his study. "The company skimming your relief funds is connected to my former fiancé's family," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me before you found it yourself, and wondered why I said nothing." Nathaniel read the document slowly. When he looked up, there was no pity in his face, which she was grateful for. "You could have hidden this. Most people protect the ones who hurt them, out of habit, if nothing else. I am done protecting people who never protected me." He set the papers down and studied her for a long moment. "I need someone I can trust completely to help me expose this properly, in a way that survives a courtroom and does not simply end with my cousin quietly disappearing to the continent. I cannot do that as your employer. An unmarried woman advising a duke on matters this sensitive would be a scandal before the ink dried. What are you proposing, Your Grace?" "A marriage," he said, plainly, the way he discussed ledgers. "Not a romance, Miss Whitmore. An arrangement. You would have my name, my protection, and full authority to finish what we started. In return, I would have the only mind in England I actually trust." Clara felt the strangeness of the moment settle over her, a proposal built entirely on respect instead of affection, offered by a man who did not pretend it was anything more than it was. "And if I say no, then I will still fight the fraud, only slower, and I will lose the best partner I have ever had in this house." He paused. "I would rather not lose either." She thought of Edmund's hallway, the gentle hands that had ended everything so easily. She thought of a year spent being pitied by people who had never once asked what she was capable of. "I accept," she said, "but I want it understood between us. I am not marrying you to be rescued. I am marrying you to finish this." "Understood," Nathaniel said, and for the first time, something warmer than respect passed across his face. "Though I confess, Miss Whitmore, I would not entirely mind if it became more than an arrangement, in time." Clara did not answer that, but she did not forget it either. The wedding was small, quiet, and legally binding, held in the Winmore Chapel, with only Nathaniel's aunt and Clara's brother Thomas as witnesses. There was no announcement in the papers. Nathaniel wanted the marriage kept private until the investigation into his cousin was finished, and Clara, still unaccustomed to the idea of being a duchess, was glad of the quiet. What followed were months that changed her more than the wedding itself. Nathaniel's aunt, Lady Constance, took it upon herself to teach Clara the language of the aristocracy, not just which fork to use, though there were many lessons on forks, but how to enter a room so that people noticed her posture before they noticed her dress, how to answer an insult with a compliment so precise it left the insulter looking foolish, how to hold silence the way other women held a fan. "Power is not loud, child," Lady Constance told her one afternoon, adjusting the drape of a new gown. "The loudest person in the room is usually the most afraid. You will learn to be the quiet one. It unsettles people far more." Clara practiced walking with a book balanced on her head until she stopped noticing the book at all. She practiced her signature until Duchess Clara Ashworth flowed from her pen as naturally as her old name once had. Lady Constance, she learned, had once been a merchant's daughter herself, elevated into the aristocracy through a marriage arranged for convenience rather than affection, and had spent 30 years learning the same lessons she now passed to Clara. "They will look for reasons to call you unworthy," Lady Constance told her, pinning a stray curl back into place. "A background like yours, in a room like that. Do not give them the satisfaction of seeing you flinch at it. I never did, and within 5 years, the same women who whispered about my father's shop were asking me for invitations to my own dinners. Did it ever stop hurting, being reminded of where you came from?" "No," Lady Constance said, with the honesty of someone long past pretending. "But it stopped mattering whether it hurt. There is a difference, my dear, and you will learn it soon enough." And in the evenings, after lessons ended, Clara returned to the study, to work alongside Nathaniel on the investigation, which was its own kind of education. They learned that Bartholomew Reyes had been funneling stolen relief money into a shipping venture with Edmund's father, disguising the theft as investment returns. Grain meant for struggling tenant families had instead financed silk shipments that made both families richer, while Winmore's poorest tenants went without the winter repairs they had been promised. "Your cousin stole food from children to buy silk," Clara said one night, staring at the final tally of missing funds. "And Edmund's family knew where the money came from." "They will both answer for it," Nathaniel said. "But we need proof, strong enough that neither can talk his way free in front of a magistrate. Half proof against powerful men only makes them more careful." It was Clara who suggested the final piece, quietly purchasing the outstanding debts against Edmund's family estate, debts that had piled up from the very fraud they were investigating. Since Edmund's father had used stolen relief money to cover his own failing shipping investments and was now drowning in obligations he could not repay. Through a solicitor who did not know her married name, Clara bought every note. "If this works," she told Nathaniel, "I will not just expose them, I will own the ground beneath Edmund's feet." Nathaniel looked at her the way he had that first night in the study, only warmer now, layered with something that had grown between them slowly, the way trust always grows. Before anyone notices, it has become love. "Remind me," he said, "never to make an enemy of you, Duchess. You already made me your wife, Your Grace." "That ship has sailed." He laughed, a real laugh, and Clara realized she had not heard him laugh like that before. She found she wanted to hear it again. Winter settled over Winmore, and with it came long evenings when the investigation slowed, and there was little to do but wait for the solicitor to finish preparing the case. Clara found herself lingering in the study, even when there were no ledgers left to examine, and she suspected Nathaniel lingered too, for reasons neither of them said aloud. One evening, a storm kept them both inside longer than planned, rain hammering the tall windows, while a fire cracked low in the hearth. Clara sat curled in the window seat, with a book she was not truly reading, and Nathaniel stood nearby, with a glass of brandy he had not truly drunk. "You've been staring at the same page for 20 minutes, he said. "You've been staring at me for 20 minutes, she answered, without looking up. "I only noticed, because you're usually better at hiding it." He set the glass down. "Perhaps I've stopped wanting to hide it." Clara finally lifted her eyes to his, and the space between them, which had always felt professional and careful, suddenly felt very small. He crossed the room slowly, giving her every chance to look away if she wished. She did not. "I told you once this was not a romance," he said quietly. "You did. I find I no longer believe in myself." He reached for her hand, the same gentle way Edmund once had, except this time the gentleness did not end in loss. It began something. Clara rose to meet him, and when he finally kissed her, it was slow and certain, nothing like the careless goodbye in a hallway a year before. It was the kind of kiss that asked a question instead of ending a conversation, and Clara answered it by staying exactly where she was. Later, with the storm still murmuring against the windows and the fire burning down to embers, they sat together in comfortable quiet, her head resting against his shoulder, his fingers laced loosely through hers. "I did not marry you to fall in love with you," Nathaniel admitted. "I am fairly certain I have done it anyway." "I did not marry you to be happy," Clara said. "I am fairly certain that happened too." They did not speak of it as a scandal or a surprise. It felt instead like the natural end of a road they had been walking toward since the first night she corrected his steward's ledgers. Outside, the storm eased into gentle rain, and inside, something that had begun as a strategic arrangement quietly became a marriage in every sense that mattered. The following morning, a letter arrived that reminded them both why the arrangement had existed in the first place. The solicitor had finished his work. The evidence against Bartholomew Reyes and the Carlyle family was complete, airtight, and ready to be revealed at the one event guaranteed to gather every relevant name in London society under a single roof, the Royal Charity Gala, 3 weeks away. What neither Clara nor Nathaniel yet knew was that Bartholomew had already sensed the walls closing in around him. A clerk at the solicitor's office, easily bribed with money that was not rightfully his to spend, had warned him weeks earlier that a formal inquiry into the Winmore tenant accounts had quietly begun. Bartholomew had spent those weeks liquidating what he could, transferring funds to accounts under false names, and preparing a passage to France that he told no one about, not even Josiah Carlyle, his partner in theft. If it comes to it, he told himself, packing a small trunk late one night in his London lodgings, let the Carless Isles answer for what the ledgers show. I will be an ocean away by the time anyone thinks to look for me. He did not yet know that Clara had already traced every false receipt back to a shipping registry that recorded his real name beside every falsified transaction, nor that copies of that registry now sat locked in a solicitor's office, waiting only for the right night to be revealed. Some men run from consequences believing speed alone will save them. It rarely does. It only delays the reckoning long enough for it to arrive with greater weight. News of the Royal Charity Gala arrived at Winmore in a cream envelope sealed with the royal household's own crest, an invitation extended to every titled family in England, including, for the first time since their private wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth. Clara held the card for a long moment, reading her new name printed in formal ink, and understood that this was the night the world would finally learn who she had become. Once this invitation is answered, Nathaniel said, watching her carefully, there is no going back to the quiet life we've had here. Everyone will know. Everyone will ask questions. Your former fiancé will be in that room. I'm aware. Are you ready for it? Clara set the invitation down and walked to the tall study window, looking out over the frost-covered grounds of the estate that was now, in every legal and practical sense, hers as much as his. She thought of the girl who had cried quietly in a carriage a year ago, certain that being left behind meant something broken in her. She thought of the woman she had become since sharper, steadier, no longer waiting for anyone's approval to know her own worth. I have spent a year becoming someone Edmund Carlyle will not recognize, she said. I would like the chance to let him see her. Lady Constance arrived the following week to oversee the final preparations, insisting on a gown made specifically for the occasion, deep emerald velvet. Chosen because, she said, green is the color of growth, my dear, and also the color of envy. Let them feel both when they look at you. While the dressmakers worked, Nathaniel and his solicitor finalized the last details of the case. Bartholomew Reyes had already fled to the continent upon hearing rumors of an investigation, which only made the evidence against him easier to present without dispute. Edmund's father, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware that the debts strangling his shipping business had all quietly changed hands, purchased one by a solicitor acting on behalf of a client whose name he had never been given. They still don't know it's you, Nathaniel said, reviewing the final paperwork. They will, Clara said, at exactly the right moment. Thomas visited Winmore the week before the gala, and Clara found him standing in the long portrait gallery, studying the painted faces of Ashworth ancestors with the same careful attention he once gave their father's account books. You look different, he told her when she found him there. Not the dress, something else. I feel different. Good, he said. I always hated watching you shrink yourself, so Edmund's family wouldn't feel outshone. You used to be the loudest person in any room before he taught you to be quiet. Did I? You corrected our grammar school tutor in front of the entire class when you were 12, because he mixed up 2 dates in the history lesson. I don't think you've done anything like that in 3 years. Clara laughed, surprised by the memory. I remember that. He was furious. He was wrong, Thomas said simply. You were right. That used to matter more to you than whether people liked hearing it. She thought about that conversation, long after Thomas returned to London, turning it over the way she once turned over Edmund's cruel gentleness. Except this memory did not ache. It settled something instead, reminding her that the woman standing in front of the mirror, on the morning of the gala, was not a stranger she had built out of necessity, but someone closer to who she had always been, before the world convinced her to make herself smaller. On the morning of the gala, Clara stood before her mirror as the final pins were placed in her hair, the tiara Nathaniel had given her, catching the morning light. She did not see a broken woman, rebuilt out of pity. She saw a woman who had rebuilt herself out of patience, intelligence, and the refusal to let one man's cruelty decide the rest of her story. Whatever happens tonight, she told her reflection, quiet enough that only she could hear it. You already won the moment you stopped waiting for him to notice. The Winmore family did not usually attend the royal charity gala under their own name in the early hours of the evening, preferring to arrive fashionably late. But Nathaniel had been delayed by a final meeting with his solicitor, leaving Clara to enter the ballroom alone for the first quarter hour. She did not mind. She wanted a moment to feel the room before it knew who she was. The Carlyle family stood near the center of the floor, exactly where they always stood, close enough to be seen, far enough to seem effortless about it. Edmund had grown a little heavier in the year since she had last seen him, his coat a shade too fashionable for a family whose fortune was quietly collapsing beneath them. Beside him stood Lady Priscilla Fenwick, pale silk draped over her thin shoulders, laughing at something too loudly for the joke to have been very good. It did not take long for Edmund to notice her. Clara watched recognition move across his face, confusion first, then something uglier, satisfaction, dressed up as concern. "Clara Whitmore," he said, crossing the floor with the easy confidence of a man who believed nothing had changed. "I did not expect to see you here. Whose invitation did you borrow?" "Good evening, Edmund. Still single, Clara," he said, loud enough for the small circle of guests near him to hear, loud enough for Priscilla's laugh to sharpen into something crueler. "I did hear you took a position as a governess, somewhere in the country. I do hope it pays enough to keep you in that dress. It's lovely, truly, for something borrowed." A few guests near them laughed, the careful, uncomfortable laugh people offer when they are unsure whether it is safe to laugh at all. Clara felt the old shame try to rise in her chest, the same shame that had once sent her weeping into a carriage. She let it rise, and then she let it pass, the way Lady Constance had taught her to let insults pass through a room without ever landing on her. "I am not single, Edmund," she said, calm as still water. "And this dress was not borrowed." "No?" Edmund smirked, glancing at Priscilla as though inviting her to enjoy the show. "Then who exactly is providing for you these days, Clara? Surely not that brother of yours." At that exact moment, the tall oak doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the low murmur of conversation across the entire room dropped into silence. Duke Nathaniel Ashworth entered, dressed in formal black, his presence commanding attention the way only true authority can, without a single raised voice. He did not look at the crowd. He looked only at Clara, and he crossed the floor directly to her, ignoring the small sea of guests who parted instinctively to let him pass. Edmund's smirk faltered as the Duke of Ashworth stopped in front of Clara, took her gloved hand, and to the audible gasp of the entire ballroom knelt before her, pressing a kiss to her hand, with the reverence of a man greeting the person he valued most in the world. "Forgive my lateness, Duchess," Nathaniel said, rising, his eyes never leaving hers. The meeting ran longer than expected. The word Duchess moved through the crowd like a struck bell. Edmund's face went the color of old parchment. "Duchess?" he repeated, the confidence draining out of his voice with each syllable. "Clara, you married the Duke of Ashworth," Clara finished for him, turning to face him fully for the first time that evening, her chin held exactly the way Lady Constance had taught her. "Yes, Edmund, I am not single. I have not been single for quite some time." Priscilla's fan slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. The circle of guests around them had grown without Clara noticing, drawn by the particular silence that only forms around a scandal in progress. Lady Whitfield, notorious for repeating everything she overheard by the following morning's breakfast, stood close enough to catch every word, her eyes wide with the particular delight of a woman who has just been handed a story worth telling for months. Clara felt the old instinct rise in her, the urge to soften the moment, to make Edmund's humiliation smaller so the room would feel more comfortable. She recognized the instinct for what it was, the same habit that had once made her shrink herself smaller so his family would not feel outshone. She let the instinct pass without acting on it. "You look unwell, Edmund," she said instead, quiet enough that only those closest could hear, cutting enough that it did not need volume to land. "I do hope it isn't something you ate. Or perhaps it's simply the shock of learning that a woman you called unworthy of your name now holds a title above every person your family has ever curried favor with." "Clara, Duchess Ashworth," Nathaniel corrected gently, his hand steady at her back. "If we are to observe proper form tonight, Mr. Carlyle." Edmund opened his mouth to respond and found, for the first time in his life, that he had nothing worth saying. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of verdict, the entire ballroom watching a man who had built his confidence on other people's smallness discover, all at once, how little of it was truly his own. Edmund tried to recover his composure, laughing weakly, though the sound carried none of its earlier confidence. "This is a fine joke, Clara. Truly. You'll forgive me if I don't believe—" "It is not a joke," Nathaniel said, his voice calm but carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. "And since you seem eager to discuss my wife's financial situation, Mr. Carlyle, perhaps this is the appropriate moment to discuss yours." He nodded once to a man standing near the refreshment table, a solicitor Clara recognized from the months of careful preparation. The man stepped forward with a leather folder that had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment. "Your father's shipping venture," Nathaniel continued, "has been operating for the last 2 years on money stolen from Winmore's tenant relief accounts, laundered through falsified grain, and repair receipts by my late cousin's agent, Bartholomew Reyes. I imagine you knew nothing of the theft itself. I do wonder, however, whether you ever questioned why your family's fortune grew so quickly during a year when every other shipping house in London struggled." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Edmund's father, standing several feet away, had gone pale enough that a nearby gentleman quietly offered him a chair. "This is slander," Edmund said, though his voice had lost its certainty entirely. "You cannot prove." "The proof is already with the magistrate," Nathaniel said. "Along with something else you may find more immediately troubling." He glanced at Clara, a silent invitation for her to finish what they had built together. "Your family's debts," Clara said, stepping forward. "The ones covering the losses from the failed silk shipments you never questioned closely enough. Every outstanding note has been purchased, all of it, quietly, over several months, by a client your solicitors never thought to identify." "By whom?" Edmund demanded, though something in his face suggested he already suspected the answer and dreaded hearing it confirmed. "By me," Clara said simply. "The house you grew up in, Edmund, the townhouse where you told me I deserved a smaller life. I hold the debt against it now. As of this evening, your family owes its remaining fortune, such as it is, to the woman you called unworthy of your name." The ballroom, which had been murmuring, fell into complete and total silence. Priscilla stepped back from Edmund's side, as though his ruin might somehow be contagious, her earlier laughter nowhere to be found in her stricken expression. "You planned this," Edmund said quietly, disbelief finally breaking through his pride. "All of it, from the very beginning." "No," Clara said. "You planned this, Edmund, the moment you decided a woman's worth could be measured in her family's income. I only finished the story you started." Before they had crossed half the ballroom, Lady Whitfield was already whispering to 3 separate guests, and Clara understood that by morning, every drawing room in London would know exactly what had happened beneath the Winmore chandeliers. She found, to her own surprise, that the thought did not frighten her. A year ago, being the subject of London's gossip had felt like drowning. Tonight, it felt like watching a debt finally paid in full. Josiah Carlyle approached them near the refreshment tables, his earlier pallor replaced by a desperate, pleading civility that Clara recognized immediately as the sound of a man realizing money could no longer solve his problem. "Your Grace," he said to Nathaniel, bowing low enough to seem almost frantic, "surely there is room for discussion. My family has served London's shipping trade for 3 generations. Whatever arrangement might satisfy. There is no arrangement to be made, Mr. Carlyle, Nathaniel said. You built your family's recent fortune on money stolen from children who went without winter repairs. The magistrate will decide what satisfies the law. My wife has already decided what satisfies her. Clara said nothing further to either Carlyle man that evening. She did not need to. She had spent a year believing her worth was something Edmund's family had to decide, and she found, standing in that ballroom with her husband's steady presence beside her, that she no longer needed their verdict on anything at all. News of the Carlyle family's ruin spread through London faster than any gossip Clara had ever been the subject of, though this time the whispers did not shame her. Within a month, Edmund's father had sold the family townhouse to settle his debts, and Edmund himself, stripped of the fortune and reputation he had valued above her, took a position as a shipping clerk in a company that was not his own, a quiet and permanent reminder of everything he had traded her for and lost anyway. Priscilla Fenwick's engagement to him ended within the week, her family's interest in the match evaporating, along with his prospects. Bartholomew Reyes was found in France 3 months later and returned to England to face the magistrate, the tenant relief funds fully restored to the families who had gone without repairs and grain through no fault of their own. Clara made certain, personally, that every affected tenant received not only what they were owed, but a written apology signed by the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth themselves, because she remembered too well what it felt like to be wronged by people who never bothered to say they were sorry. On a quiet evening some weeks after the gala, Clara sat with Nathaniel in the same study where they had first met, over a stack of confusing ledgers, though the room felt entirely different now. The fire was warm. His hand rested easily over hers. Thomas, her brother, had taken a position managing correspondence for the estate, secured on his own merit rather than his sister's marriage, exactly as Clara had insisted. "Do you regret any of it?" Nathaniel asked. "The arrangement, the scandal, all of it beginning the way it did." Clara considered the question honestly. "I regret that it took a man's cruelty to show me my own strength. I do not regret anything that came after. And if Edmund had never left you that night in the hallway, then I would never have answered an advertisement in the Gazette," Clara said, smiling. "And I would never have met a duke who values my mind more than my dowry. That sometimes the worst night of your life is only the door to a better one, even if you can't see it while you're standing inside it." Nathaniel lifted her hand to his lips, the same gesture he had offered her in front of the entire ballroom, except now it belonged only to the two of them, quiet and unwitnessed, and entirely real. For whoever is watching this, and recognizing their own story in Clara's, the narrator's voice offers gently, "Let this be the lesson worth keeping. The people who discard you rarely deserve the credit for who you become afterward. Build your strength quietly. Let your results speak instead of your anger, and never let one person's small opinion convince you that you are anything less than exactly enough." Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.